So we change the topic. We talk about spin. And we heard a definition this morning earlier, biased presentation on interpretation to make results look more favorable. The first presentation will be given by Mona Ghannad from Amsterdam. Identification and classification of spin in clinical studies evaluating biomarkers in ovarian cancer. Where's the text? We don't have a text on the screen. Can the technicians help, please? Otherwise, we have slides without text. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present. I'm very honored to be here among such presenters this morning. First, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of my co-authors, Maria Olsen, Isabel Boutron, and Patrick Boussu to the project, and the European Commission for funding the project. I'm going to tell you about the project Identification and Classification of Spin in Clinical Studies Evaluating Biomarkers in Ovarian Cancer. So we heard earlier definition of spin, and this may be redundant, but spin is a form of misrepresentation of study findings. It's defined as a way of reporting that is conscious, but very often unconscious, that makes the study findings appear more favorable than the results justify. So the term spin was first used in the medical literature in the BMJ in 1995 by Richard Horton, about the rhetoric of research. He looked deeply in the discussion section of an article and the specific strategy to spin the study results. This is one of the first studies to systematically evaluate the prevalence of spin in published articles. Boutron and colleagues assessed spin in a sample of randomized controlled trials with statistically non-significant results for the primary outcome. They found that one very frequent strategy of spin was to actually focus on statistically significant results, but for subgroup analysis or secondary outcome. Linguistic spin was also frequently used. For example, they claimed that the association approached but did not achieve statistical significance, claiming or emphasizing the beneficial effect of the treatment despite it not being statistically significant. The level of spin they found was quite high. It was 60% in the abstract conclusion and 50% in main text conclusions. So we were interested in this topic, and we wanted to evaluate spin, but specifically in clinical studies, evaluating the performance of biomarkers in ovarian cancer. The reason we chose the specific topic is, as this commentary in the BMC by D.M. Mindus points out, this is an area with many promising publications, yet very few biomarkers have successfully been implemented or reached clinical translation in the last 30 years. Part of the reason is attributed to the technical challenges, but additional reasons are attributed to actually problems with bad methodology and poor reporting, which is very similar to other areas of biomedical research. So we searched all studies evaluating the performance of biomarkers in ovarian cancer that were published and indexed in PubMed in 2015. We included all markers of ovarian cancer risk, screening, prognosis, or treatment response in either body fluid, tissue, or imaging measurements. In the first phase, we identified 1,000 citations approximately in PubMed, and after title and abstract screening, we had about half of the citations that we then screened for full text. Finally, after full text screening, about 30% of the articles met all inclusion criteria, and the first 200 studies were ranked according to publication date, and we included that in our analysis. In order to evaluate spin, we developed a scoring system. We first listed the potential categories of spin, and then designed and piloted the data extraction form. And it was validated by a second reviewer. We classified spin into two categories: actual forms of spin and facilitators of spin. Only 32% of the articles had no spin, 31% had one form of spin, and 37% had two or more forms of spin. Here, we can see the different categories of spin that we identified in the studies, which I will talk about with examples. The most frequent strategy of spin that we found was for biomarkers that claimed other purposes that were not investigated, and that was about 32%. The exaggerated claim was made either in the main text conclusion or in the abstract conclusion, or in some cases both. So the following article exemplifies three different categories of spin. This is a diagnostic study, and the authors evaluated a biomarker panel for early ovarian cancer detection. In the discussion, they conclude on the potential of this platform as a screening method, which is neither the study aim nor is it investigated. In addition to this, the authors also claimed that the biomarker panel allows for faster results and lower costs. This claim was also not investigated. Another mismatch was between the biomarker's intended clinical application and the population recruited. This study aimed to evaluate early ovarian cancer detection, but in a sample size of 31 patients that they recruited, 9 patients were of late-stage ovarian cancer, and 7 patients were healthy control, exemplifying the extreme controls that they used that did not match the study design. We also, I think I skipped ahead. Yes. No, I didn't. We also identified mismatch in the title and abstract conclusion compared to the results presented in the main text. The reason we looked at the title and the abstract is because the title and the abstract are the most widely read part of the article. We also looked at mismatch between the conclusion in the discussion and the results in the main text, and between the results reported in the abstract versus the results reported in the main text. So we see examples of this mismatch in this article. This study looked at a score to identify ovarian cancer patients who don't benefit from primary surgery. Although the title suggests that they were evaluating the score, the results and conclusion focus on two proteins, neither of which are in the OV-score algorithm. The two proteins were, I'm going to mention them, KLK5 and 7. And the reason I mention them is when you look in the abstract, they use other KLKs for the algorithm, but not the ones that they actually reported on in the results. They also claim that the OV-score is a strong and statistically significant predictor of surgical success, but there is no statistical test in the results. They only report an AUC value. We also identified mismatch between the intended aim and the study conclusion. For example, in this prognostic study, they investigated which microRNAs are differentially expressed in chemosensitive ovarian cancer tissues. In the conclusion, they summarized that the microRNA 1307 that they found may play a role in the development of chemoresistance in ovarian cancer. However, the cross-sectional design of the study doesn't permit conclusions about immunological mechanism affecting tumor progression. Here are some examples of spin facilitators that we identified. Almost all the studies did not present any sample size calculations. They did not discuss any harms or pre-specify a hypothesis. 56% did not specify a threshold for the continuous biomarker. Such practices often lead to post hoc analysis after initial inspection of the data, and it gives room for manipulation of the results to make it look more favorable. So in conclusion, we have seen that spin is also prevalent in clinical studies evaluating biomarkers in ovarian cancer. The categories of spin were diverse, and it's possible that it's one of the explanations for the failure of biomarkers to reach clinical translation. And we should look at potential strategies and interventions to help authors avoid spin. So what can we do to remedy spin? Well, one thing that was also mentioned with the presenters is before the study starts to write the protocol and have them registered. We could also use a template for writing the abstract, since the abstract and abstract conclusions are the most read parts of the publication. We can follow reporting guidelines. These checklists can have extensions with recommendations on how results should be interpreted and how to avoid spin, including limitations of the study. And I think they can help attenuate spin. Peer reviewers also have an essential role in detecting and deleting spin from published reports. So we can identify spin at peer review stage and invite the reviewers, or editors perhaps, to write the title and the abstract to avoid bias and generous interpretation of study results. Another thing we can do is training researchers and junior trainees to teach them about spin and its consequences. I remember when I first learned about spin, I didn't know that it was something you're not supposed to do. I thought it's something you do to get published. And lastly, to do more research on research. I'm fortunate to be part of one of the PhD trainees working on methods on research and on reporting in the field of clinical research. And I hope that my PhD, as part of the MIR project, will lead to evidence-based strategies to avoid or attenuate exaggerated claims in reports of biomarker studies and other clinical studies. Thank you for your attention.
Questions, please?
I'm Adrienne Fu Berman. I direct Farmed Out, a research and education project on inappropriate pharmaceutical company promotion at Georgetown. And we've done a lot of work on promotional tone in industry-funded articles. We're currently working on a computational linguistics project looking at whether we can tell industry-funded from non-industry-funded articles. So my question to you is whether you looked at industry funding and spin in your study.
We did look at industry funding or funding in general, whether it was non-government or industry. I haven't presented the results as I haven't analyzed them yet, but a lot of the times actually the funding is not reported. So that introduces.
Thank you.
Robert Danziger from Chicago. I wonder if you think the high-profile lay literature, like the New York Times and so forth, should have some responsibility in reducing spin. Because this is where it enters the real realm.
I think there's a study that looked at how spin in publications affects spin in media. And the results were that when the publication has spin, it's more likely that the media report on the publication will also be spun. But I don't know if in that context where the responsibility lies, but I certainly think that as researchers, we have a responsibility to report the results as we find them and not in necessarily a better light.
Deborah Zarin from clinicaltrials.gov. Just a public service announcement. One place to find results without any spin is clinicaltrials.gov, where we aim to have just the facts and don't allow people to have any subjective narrative places, so there's no discussion or conclusions. And it might be it's something that journals could link to, so they could say sort of here's a place with just the facts and here's the author's discussion. I think it's, in general, very hard to separate spin from other subjective things that are going to naturally go into a discussion and conclusion section.
Thank you. And on that note, my colleague Maria Olsen is looking at how many of the studies have the protocol registered. So it would be also interesting to look at, we're working collaboration, the studies that have a high frequency of spin, how many of them actually have a protocol registered?
And I was talking about, so that's important, but I was referring to the summary results, the actual results that might also be in clinicaltrials.gov.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Laura Oldock from Johns Hopkins. I'm a graduate student. I wanted to ask about one of the one of the studies that you described. I read it kind of quickly, but it looked like it was sort of a tools development paper, and they sort of suggested a future use of the tool that they had developed. And I wonder how you differentiate between inappropriate spin and kind of appropriate future direction suggestions in a context like that.
So is this the study you're referring to?
That's the one, with the platform, yeah.
With the platform, yes. Well, I think the discussion has room to propose other study designs that can investigate the role of the biomarker they find based on their preliminary results for other aims. But what I identified as spin is claiming that it is useful for a screening panel when the methodology and the results did not match that. And they concluded on that in the results.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi,
Okay, there are 3 questions left, so short questions, please.
Rick Anderson from the University of Utah and also the Scholarly Kitchen blog. My question, and forgive me if this was answered in your presentation and I just missed it, but one of the things that you suggested is that peer review can help to eliminate spin.
Yes.
Did you notice a different level of incidence of spin among peer-reviewed journals in your study?
Well, actually, all the journals we looked at were peer-reviewed.
Okay.
And I have to say that among some of the articles that I looked at, there were sentences that were addressed to the reviewer that were not actually deleted. So peer review did not certainly catch all of the even mistakes that were there.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Are Brianna from Norway. Thanks for a most interesting study. There was one point I was missing from your conclusions, and that was that I think your study shows amply the importance of a rigorous editorial process and competent journal editors who could reduce spin. So that's why we all are here, I think.
Yes. And also I think authors may be biased, and their enthusiasm to get published may influence them to interpret the results more generously than they really should. So I think in that...
And that's why you need a competent editor.
Yes.
Steve?
Steve Goodman from Stanford. So this is a great study. I think we've seen that these kinds of studies with diagnostic tests and predictive tests in general, you could pick any area and get the same results. I'm wondering about the use of the word spin, though, to encompass a very broad range of issues that are, could be under things like falsification or misstatement of results. And you have inconsistencies, you have overgeneralization, you have a whole range of things that are actually frank errors. And then you have issues of what might be interpretation. And I think it's very important that we don't call, and I don't think you did, issues that are interpretive and say that all of that is spin, where there are these other issues that are really, really misrepresentations of what they studied and sometimes the results themselves. So I think this is a generic problem that I don't think we can go directly from results to conclusions and recommendations. It is an intellectual effort, and we should be careful to separate that process, which I think is the heart of science, from what you're describing, which could have a whole bunch of other labels associated with it other than spin, which is real misrepresentation of what they found.
That is correct. So spin is generally misrepresentation. and overinterpretation of the study results. There were certainly a lot of mistakes in the articles that we looked at, but we didn't categorize that as spin. But there is the issue or the limitation that spin can be subjective, and there are no systematic criteria yet developed to evaluate spin, and partially it's because it's based on study design. So I think there's more research needed in the field to shine more light on it.
Last question.